Hi, and welcome to this beginner's guide to bus processing. Let's start by defining the term. A bus simply adds multiple signals together. The most important bus in your project is the master bus, otherwise known as the mix bus, where all your individual channels are summed together to create one stereo signal. If you add processing to this master channel, you're processing the entire mix. We also use buses when we create send effects. If I send a few different channels to a reverb effect, these channels all get mixed together before being processed by an all-wet reverb. And the resulting reverb-only signal can then be blended with the dry signals. Technically, this is bus processing, as the signals are added together at a bus and then processed by the reverb. But this kind of effect send setup isn't what we're usually referring to when we use the term, as in this case the dry signal still just goes directly to the mix bus. And if I turn down the reverb channel, we only lose the reverb effect. The term bus processing more usually refers to the use of subgroups. In this case, the dry signals don't go directly to the mix bus. First, they get mixed together with a group of other related channels, and then that subgroup is routed to the mix bus. The method you use to achieve this will vary depending on the DAW you're using. In Reaper, I can create a folder track, in this case containing all my drum channels, and the folder track will automatically become a subgroup. Other DAWs might use a more traditional hardware mixer paradigm. In this case, I need to change the output routing for my drum channels so they all go to the drum bus instead of direct to mix. This allows us to adjust the level of the whole drum kit using just a single fader, but also allows us to process the whole drum kit by loading plugins onto the subgroup channel. Let's consider a few of the most common options. If I load an EQ onto the subgroup, I can EQ all the drums together. These classic drum machine samples have bags of character, but they all benefit from a gentle cut in the lower mids to reduce the boxy character, and another to stop this lower region conflicting with the bass part. And as the kick drum is the only element with significant content in the low sub-bass, I can shape the low end of the kick in any way I like without really affecting anything else. In this case, EQing the group gives exactly the same results as if I EQ'd every channel individually using the same settings. But using just a single instance on the group is much more efficient. A single EQ instance uses fewer of your processor cycles than would multiple instances. But this is not so important, as any modern processor can handle many instances of Pro Q3 without breaking a sweat. More importantly, it allows you to work more quickly, which makes you more productive and probably leads to better results. The longer you spend listening to a mix in progress, the more you lose your perspective, and the harder it becomes to gauge how your mix will sound to a fresh pair of ears. This approach doesn't preclude also EQing individual channels. For example, I might try crisping up the sound with a boost around 8 kHz, but then cut back that same region for the hi-hat channel to stop it getting too bright. And this is still more efficient than loading and adjusting a separate EQ instance for every drum channel. Starting with broad brush EQ changes applied to subgroups can be a very effective way to get a good basic mix together quickly, which can then be refined with tweaks to individual channels if needed. And this approach is often referred to as top-down mixing. The reason a single EQ on a subgroup can be equivalent to EQing each individual channel is because a clean EQ such as Pro Q3 is totally linear. In DSP terms, this means it behaves the same way regardless of the incoming signal level, and hence EQing each channel before adding them together is the same as adding them together first, then EQing the result. This ceases to be true as soon as you start to use Pro Q3's dynamic features, however. Now we have a non-linearity, because this dynamic band is reacting to the input signal and compressing the dynamic range for that region. If I ran multiple instances of this setting on individual channels, each instance would see a different input signal, resulting in different dynamic behavior. Okay, now let's try compression. Here's how it sounds if I compress each element individually. The kick and snare now sound punchier and more focused. And we've lost most of the dynamics in the hi-hat part. Now let's try compressing them all on the subgroup instead. I can achieve a similar extra attack and focus for the kick and snare parts. But the hi-hats aren't hitting the threshold at all with this setting, so we're not losing the accents of the original part. But because the compressor gain reduction is applied to the mixed subgroup, the gain reduction applied to kick and snare hits now also affects the hi-hat. Changing the release time doesn't only change the decay of the kick and snare hits, it now also changes the way the hi-hats ride up in level in the pauses between kick and snare hits, and can therefore affect the groove of the drums. Compression is non-linear by definition. It reacts to and shapes the dynamics of the incoming signal. So unlike EQ, compressing a subgroup is never the same as compressing the individual elements separately. Here's a subgroup with all my guitar and synth parts. When I compress them all together, they start to interact, with loud events from one part ducking all the other parts in level. And this interaction between parts is often called glue. The gluing effect is strongest when you compress the entire mix on the mix bus. But gluing together just a subgroup can also be a very useful approach. Watch my beginner's guide to compression for a more detailed look at this effect. Saturation is also a non-linear process. Turning up the input level results in more saturation and more added harmonics, while turning it down makes the sound cleaner. And like compression, saturation will behave differently when applied to a whole subgroup instead of each individual part. Each part will gain harmonics just as it would if processed alone. But as well as this, we'll also get intermodulation, as each part changes the way all the other parts hit the nonlinear distortion stage. Intermodulation quickly starts to sound nasty if there's too much of it, so you'll usually need to keep the saturation pretty subtle when processing subgroups or a full mix. But in small amounts, it adds its own subtle kind of gluing effect, helping the parts to gel together better. For my money, this is the key to the elusive analog sound that's so sought after. Small amounts of saturation on buses can help to create that expansive, warm yet clear sound characteristic of many classic analog recordings, while too much of it can recreate the muddy, cluttered, or abrasive character of many forgotten bad recordings from the same era. Check out my Beginner's Guide to Distortion and Beginner's Guide to Saturation videos if you want to know more about intermodulation. In a real-world mix, we're likely to be using EQ and compression and saturation, which complicates things a little. If the EQ on your subgroup comes before any nonlinearities, such as compression or saturation, then it will still be equivalent to the same EQ setting applied to all the individual channels in that group, so long as those individual channel EQs all come after any compressors or saturators on those channels. But if the individual channel EQs are running before the nonlinearities, or if the subgroup EQ is running after them, the two will no longer be equivalent, as EQ before a nonlinearity isn't the same as EQ after a nonlinearity. So what about more creative effects? Obviously, a filter sweep is more dramatic in effect when applied to a whole mix instead of just a single element. But equally, you could apply creative effects to a smaller subset of parts, like bass, keys and guitar, for example. As complex as this filter setup seems, it is in fact almost entirely linear. The LFO and step sequencer modulation don't care about input levels and would still behave the same way if I ran multiple instances on the individual channels instead. Further to the right, we find an envelope follower, which definitely does depend on input levels. But if we look closer, we see that it's set to listen to the sidechain input to which I've routed the kick drum, so the resonance for the lower filter is turned down on every kick drum hit. Assuming you set up the same sidechain routing for each channel, this would again behave the same way, running as multiple separate instances. In fact, the only real non-linearities in this preset are within the filters themselves. If I switched to the clean type, then this preset, as complex as it seems, would be just as linear as a static EQ setting in Pro Q3. This timeless preset is similar. The step sequencer modulation of the dry-wet mix would be the same if applied to each individual channel. Even the delay time modulation would be the same. But I'm again using filter models which include saturation, and more importantly, I'm modulating them with an envelope follower, and this time it's set to listen to the main inputs rather than the sidechain. This preset is therefore definitely non-linear and wouldn't sound the same if applied to each channel separately. Finally, here's a Saturn preset, which modulates the drive parameter for the destroy type of distortion. This includes some clipping for very loud signals, and bit crushing, which mostly affects quieter signals. But the most significant part of the sound is the sample rate reduction, which doesn't care about input level at all. However, the modulation in this preset has a strong random element, provided by the third XLFO. If you ran individual instances for each channel, each would have a different random value, and the result would be very different. If I put them all together, the individual parts get glitched up and modulated together, creating something altogether new. In this case, the resonance of the Volcano high-pass filter gets a bit overwhelming at times. But rather than turning down the resonance and losing the self-oscillation between kick drums, I'm instead going to use a multiband compressor to keep the low frequencies under control. Multiband compression can also be useful on buses to control the extreme low or high ends, or tame harshness in the upper mid-range, or selectively glue parts of the mid-range. But we're starting to go beyond beginner's level now, so I'll leave it there. Bye for now, and thanks for watching.